America is on the verge of an unprecedented moment that will change the country forever. At the center of it all, the most powerful banker in America.
I think critics would say that he was greedy, he was a control freak, he was a monopolist, and he was also very rich.
This man is trying to make a deal that today's Jamie Dimon, Ray Dalio, or BlackRock's Larry Fink would only dream about. And if the deal closes, this man will change the history of America forever. JP Morgan is not just trying to create the largest steel company in the world.
After his creation of U.S. Steel, he controlled somewhere between 60 and 70% of the American steel industry.
He's on a mission to create something unprecedented, the world's first billion-dollar corporation. His counterplayer is a self-made industrialist who rose to define America's steel empire. Andrew Carnegie is already in his mid-60s and he's ready to sell to JP Morgan, but not without a price. $480 million. For Carnegie, it would be the ultimate retirement, leaving the industry at its peak to become the richest man in the world. What few know is that for Morgan, it's something far bigger.
This deal isn't just about steel. It's about control. Control over an industry, a nation, and a new era of capitalism.
A simple handshake could create history. A man would claim the title of America's richest, the other, its undisputed king of finance, the real-life Mr. Monopoly. But unlike the smiling cartoon character on your board game box, the real-life version is far darker, far more ruthless, and far more dangerous. This is the story of the deal that changed America forever. Born into one of America's most elite families in 1837, John Pierpont Morgan's inheritance isn't just wealth, but privilege, status, and great footsteps to fill. To provide exclusive insights, we interviewed Richard Silla, the chairman of the board of trustees of the Museum of American Finance and professor emeritus of economics at the Stern School of Business, New York University.
Morgan came from a moneyed family. Moneyed in two senses. They were wealthy, but in addition, they were in the business of money. And Morgan understood at a very early age that money was what made everything else happen.
His uncle co-founded Yale University, another wrote the Christmas classic Jingle Bells, and his father, Junius Spencer Morgan, is a respected investment banker with connections spanning continents.
Junius Spencer Morgan expected that his son would follow in his footsteps and succeed in the business world.
JP isn't born with a silver spoon. He has a seat reserved at the table of power. But he soon learns a lesson that would define his life. Power isn't granted, it's taken. And so living in the shadow of greatness isn't enough for Morgan. Still a boy, he begins leaving his own mark. However, his path is riddled with great obstacles.
He really had two personalities. One was this very jolly, animated, high-spirited, outgoing boy with tremendous energy and health. But then he would suddenly get these fainting spells, and that was accompanied by a personality that was more that of a brooding loner.
For the time of his childhood, illnesses like severe fevers, facial rashes, and crippling migraines often confine him to his room for weeks at a time. But whenever his health permits, he fearlessly challenges his teachers, arguing his way out of punishments and bending rules to his will. Classmates do not see him as just another peer. They follow him, drawn by a charisma that demands loyalty. Yet, when he is forced to isolate, he fills the lonely hours with reading, reflection, and solitaire, a game that would become his lifelong obsession. But he has another obsession that will prove to be far more dangerous in the long run: control.
He was the head of a sort of group of people, the money trust that monopolized American finance, and He controlled too much money in New York. He had too much power.
Just like in the board game Monopoly, Morgan isn't content with controlling a single property. He wants to defeat his rivals and dominate the board. He wants it all, only that his playing field is nothing less than the American economy. Morgan is about to roll the dice and ready to move to his next stop, the old continent. He is headed to London. When Morgan was 17, his father moved the family to London for a new business opportunity. Junius Morgan has been watching his son closely. He sees the raw talent in his son, that razor-sharp mind, that natural command of others. But something's missing. A prestigious business school in Switzerland seems like the answer, perfect for polishing rough edges. Junius Morgan quickly realizes his mistake. His son doesn't need more schooling. What he needs is real-world experience, and he needs to get his hands dirty. So at 20, young Morgan sails back to America. But this isn't some cushiony homecoming. This is a test. He lands an unpaid position at a New York bank. Daddy's connections, sure, but JP's chance to prove himself. But don't mistake this for a father supporting his son. J.S. Morgan isn't nurturing JP. He is using him as a tool.
And he was sort of the American agent for his father's banking firm with J.S. Morgan and Company in London.
JP is supposed to be the bridge between European and American money, and his task is clear: make the family richer than it already is. And oh boy, does Morgan deliver. His ambition and work ethic are unmatched, even among senior staff, and by 23, he's crisscrossing the country to broker high-stakes deals. But it's the side hustles that really show his genius. Take New Orleans, 1857, when JP is on his way to Cuba. Picture this: a desperate ship captain, an entire boatload full of slowly rotting coffee, and no buyers in sight. Most people see massive risk, but Morgan? He sees dollar signs. Without waiting for approval from his bosses, Morgan strikes a handshake deal and buys the whole coffee shipment for pennies on the dollar. Then, without ever touching the coffee, Morgan turns around and sells it to merchants and markets for double, triple, even quadruple the price. By the end of the week, Morgan has sold every last bean, walking away with massive profits.
He said the real risk was that he had misjudged the character of the captain, and that the captain would have lied to him. And this is sort of the quintessential issue of Morgan, that he was able to look at people and immediately make a judgment of their character and of their integrity, and one of his greatest strengths.
Feeling good about himself, JP returns to New York expecting applause, but instead he gets a verbal lashing. The old cautious bankers, including his father, think Morgan is reckless. To them, he is playing with too much risk, and it's not even his money. But to Morgan, this isn't recklessness. It's only proof that boldness and quick thinking are the real keys to success, and he's just getting started. By 1861, just 4 years after arriving in New York, Morgan's done playing banker for someone else. His ambition is too big for the confines of a bank. So he opens his own business, JP Morgan & Co. His father, of course, is impressed with his initiative, but he still doesn't trust him. Junius agrees with his son's former bosses. JP is bold to the point of danger, always testing boundaries and flirting with risk. Consequently, Morgan's new company is still under the financial supervision of his father. Junius is not supporting him. He is investing in him, and like any investor, he expects a return. For Morgan, this isn't the freedom he hoped for. He is still a tool for his father's ambitions. But slowly, JP is beginning to pull on the strings that control him. One of the perks of Morgan's New York life is the high society that comes with it. Lavish parties, expensive lunches, and constant mingling with the elite become part of his routine. It is at one of these parties that he meets Amelia Sturgis, known as Mimi. She's everything Morgan could have wanted. Beautiful, charming, and from a wealthy banking family. He wastes no time courting her and soon buys her a ring from Tiffany's. But as they plan their wedding, Mimi begins to cough. The cough grows worse each day, leaving her breathless and frail. A doctor confirms their worst fears: tuberculosis. In those days, tuberculosis was nearly always a death sentence. But Morgan refuses to give up. They marry anyway, and he sends her away to Algiers, hoping the warm weather might ease her suffering. It doesn't. Mimi dies just a few months later.
It was a terrible loss for him, and he failed. But he knew what he was getting into, oddly enough. He was daring, and almost he was daring death in some sort of dramatic way, and attempting to control it.
Morgan returns to New York a shattered man.
The loss was so powerful that, in a way, it forced him to keep his genuinely emotional nature under tight control.
But instead of grieving, Morgan pours himself into his work with a new determination. If he can't control life, he can at least control business. Nonetheless, the country is out of control. As Morgan rebuilds his life, war breaks out across the United States. The Civil War divides the country and the government begins drafting able-bodied men to fight. Morgan fits the bill, but he isn't about to risk his life on the battlefield. For $300, he pays for replacement, the other Morgan, as he calls him, to serve in his place. Instead of fighting with weapons, Morgan fights in boardrooms, seizing opportunities others can't see. One such opportunity teeters at the edge of legality.
Well, I think in the Civil War, Morgan was a very young man. He was only in his early 20s, and he was sort of the American agent for his father's banking firm with J.S. Morgan and Company in London. So that was he was learning the ropes as a young man. And I think he got into a financial deal. There was a shortage of weapons, I guess, going into the American Civil War. There were some guns available, and Morgan financed the deal, but apparently the guns had defects, and so they were not the best of equipment. Now, I don't know whether Morgan knew that the guns were defective. He was obviously trying to make some money by arranging to provide the Abraham Lincoln's army with the weapons that it needed, and it turned out some of these weapons were faulty.
Despite the defects, Morgan ends up selling the rifles back to the government at a 600% profit. His father is furious. The deal is risky, predatory, and scandalous. Junius urges Morgan to be more cautious, to slow down and focus on safer investments. But Morgan doesn't listen, and he would soon be facing much bigger controversies. Anyways, he soon orchestrates a deal to control $2 million in gold bars. By shipping half of it overseas, he creates a temporary shortage in New York. As prices soar, Morgan sells his share for a massive profit.
Gold is money. Everything else is credit.
Once again, he expects praise. Once again, his father is livid. To Junius, JP's ambition is spinning out of control. To Worries, his deals are bold, but they are also exploitative, reckless, and at times only semi-legal, that his son is becoming too much to handle.
But I think he was, remember, a young man. He was just learning the ropes, and it seems that his father thought he might be a little reckless, and so he managed to get young son J.P. Morgan, J.S. Morgan, sort of had him form a partnership with some older, more experienced bankers, and to maybe settle him down so he didn't get into any more questionable deals like that rifle deal during the early days of the American Civil War.
By the time JP Morgan reaches 33, he is ready to give up. Making money has become too easy. It no longer challenges him. And despite the name on his company, he still doesn't have the freedom to act on his own terms. Morgan wants out, but Junius refuses to let him quit. Instead, his father introduces him to Anthony Drexel, a rising star in the banking world. Together, they formed Drexel, Morgan & Co. in 1871, the partnership that will change the country forever. What if you could add 10 to 30 qualified sales calls to your calendar every month using YouTube with less than 3 hours of work per month? And if we don't deliver in 90 days, you don't pay. Let's face it, most business owners want to grow with content, but they get stuck. You don't have the time, you don't have the team. And YouTube, it feels like a full-time job. Ideating, scripting, editing, SEO, it's overwhelming. So instead you waste hours on manual outreach, struggle to close sales, and fail to establish the authority that your brand deserves. That's where content to cash flow comes in. We built your entire YouTube sales funnel. Scripting, production, strategy, ranking, everything. It's white glove and done for you. And it's guaranteed to drive results. 10 to 30 sales calls per month in 90 days or you don't pay. And this is what it looks like after the first 90 days of us working together. Top-tier talking head channels helping their owners generate tens of thousands for their business. And sometimes more than 70% of their business leads come through YouTube for them. If you're ready to turn content into consistent cash flow without lifting a finger, you have two options. The first one is to click below and book your no-pressure YouTube strategy coffee chat together with us, during which we'll map out your entire YouTube sales funnel. The second option is you click below and you download our free YouTube for Business guide. When history makes a man rich, it's often because he is in the right place at the right time. JP Morgan is no different. The 1870s are a golden era for America and for Morgan.
He's living in a country that was changing very rapidly, growing very rapidly, and the changes were like a transition from an agricultural to an industrial economy, fueled by new technologies that were technologies of mass production.
The Civil War is over, the economy is thriving, and wealth is being created at a staggering pace. Just a few years earlier, there were only 20 millionaires in the entire country. By now, you can hardly walk down the street in Morgan's New York neighborhood without bumping into one. The population has skyrocketed in 40 years. And so has the demand for steel, oil, and railroads. This is the age of the other robber barons, where a man like Andrew Carnegie controls nearly half of America's steel, and Rockefeller dominates 90% of its oil. It is the perfect time to be in business, but unlike steel or oil, no single person controls the railroads. Nevertheless, JP Morgan will first find other ways to profit from the economic boom. What do all these booming businesses have in common? They need money. That's where Drexel, Morgan & Co. comes in. Whether it is founding oil companies, forming corporate trusts, launching telephone companies, or financing electricity grids, every major venture in the country seems to pass through Morgan's doors. He doesn't just facilitate deals, he makes them possible. Morgan is brilliant at his job, and he is getting very rich because of it. When the average American earns $500 a year, Morgan regularly pockets $500,000. But money isn't enough. As Morgan climbs higher, he sees a bigger opportunity. Morgan knows that to become a robber baron himself like Carnegie and Rockefeller, he needs his own empire. That's when he sets his sights on the railroads.
At the time, railroad industry, right, in the late 1800s, whereas it was by far the most important industry in America by far. It's like what the internet or AI would be now.
But similar to AI companies today, railroad businesses are bleeding money. The industry is a chaotic patchwork of competing interests. Thousands of bondholders and shareholders fight for control.
And all of this was going on in the United States at the time, and it could be a little chaotic at times. There was a lot of cutthroat competition.
Dozens of companies scramble to claim land rights, laying thousands of miles of tracks that often overlap. Rail lines are doubled or even tripled, running side by side as rival firms bicker and battle.
The great problem that at that time was that the new technologies, railroad technologies, industrial technologies, technologies of mass production had very high fixed costs, but then very low marginal costs. And that's what encouraged price cutting, because once you built the railroad, then it was fairly cheap to, carry freight somewhere. So the railroads were continually undercutting prices of each other. And this was endangering the investment value of the railroads.
It is a logistical mess and a financial nightmare. But to Morgan, it is beautiful. Underneath the chaos, he sees untapped potential. The railroads aren't just a business, they are a foundation. Railroads connect cities, industries, and entire economies.
And, Morgan was heavily involved in the railroad business, which meant that the products of mass production industries could be distributed to a wide range of consumers rather cheaply through railroad transportation.
Whoever controls the rails doesn't just make money. They control the future of America. But the railroads are different from other businesses. While a typical company might need $1 million to get off the ground, a single railroad can require up to $35 million. For Morgan, that isn't a drawback. It's an invitation. To make the big bucks, you have to play with big bucks. And few banks on Wall Street have the kind of resources Morgan can offer. Making money comes easily to him. It always has.
Money equals business, which equals power, all of which come from character and trust.
At this point in Morgan's life, it's about far more than that. He isn't just a banker anymore. The railroads offer more than profits. They offer power. He is becoming the American Napoleon, but he will soon be met with one of the hardest tests the railroad business has to offer: a robber baron's trial by fire. The Cairo and Vincennes Railroad is in trouble. The company has borrowed $3.5 million to finance a 150-mile trek in Illinois, but they can't repay the bond.
The railroads were built largely by issuing bonds. They issued bonds, and the bond contract is a sort of contract where the investor buys the bond and is promised to get periodic interest payments on the bonds and get your money back at the end of the bond's term. What happened with the American railroads issuing a lot of bonds is that they started competing with each other in cutthroat ways, which meant they didn't earn enough money to pay the interest on the bonds.
The Cairo and Vincennes Railroad faces the same problem. Morgan wants his money back and is calling in the debt. And for most bankers, that would have been the end of the story. A normal bank would have forced the company into bankruptcy and cut its losses. But Morgan isn't a normal banker. Instead of walking away, he sees an opportunity.
So Morgan looked at this and he said, well, one way to eliminate this problem is to change the capital structure of the railroad companies.
Rather than selling off the Cairo and Vincennes Railroad, Morgan wants to restructure the company's finances. More equity, less debt. But that's not all. He doesn't just want his money back. He wants control over the company's affairs by establishing a new board of directors and naming himself chairman. The move raises eyebrows. Whispers spread across Wall Street. What is Morgan doing? Is he out of his mind? Why not cut his losses? Who does this banker think he is, stepping into the role of a business owner? But Morgan doesn't care about the whispers. The Cairo and Vincennes Railroad is just the beginning. Morgan repeats his tactic again and again, seizing control of struggling companies he finances. He has a strategy. When a company can't pay its debts, Morgan restructures the deal to put himself in a position of power. Over time, his method earns a name: Morganization. At first, it's simple. Morgan steps in to save failing companies, ensuring he has a seat at the table to steer them back to profitability. But as his reputation grows, businesses begin to approach Morgan willingly, offering him unprecedented control in exchange for his expertise and financial backing. It becomes the only way to do business with him. Give Morgan ultimate power, or he'll walk away. The railroads become his specialty. But not everyone welcomes Morgan's influence.
He was powerful. He used his power, but because he made deals that sometimes were not in the best interests of the companies that he was merging, he got this reputation of having a lot of power.
Morgan, never one to back down, rises to his full 6'2" height, towering over the man. Peering at him over his bulbous nose, Morgan declares,
"Your railroads belong to my clients."
The room falls silent. The message is clear.
Physically, Morgan was an overwhelming presence. He had piercing black eyes that could seem to look through people and read their minds.
His presence looms over every board he sits on. Executives might hold the title of president, but every decision subtly checks for Morgan's approval. Everyone knows who truly holds the power, and Morgan isn't content with just fixing failing companies. He begins consolidating railroads, merging smaller operations into larger, more efficient systems. The mergers make money, but that isn't all Morgan cares about. At the helm of these vast networks, he wields something even greater: control. His influence over the railroads grows so immense that when two of the largest companies go to war with each other, it is Morgan who steps in to resolve the conflict. In typical JP Morgan fashion, his solution is part showmanship, part bullying, and entirely about asserting dominance. But his ambition doesn't stop there. The Corsair is his next stage, and the stakes are higher than ever. At the height of his career, JP Morgan doesn't live in New York. Instead, he resides on a sprawling 368-acre estate along the Hudson north of the city. It is a picturesque retreat where his wife and children enjoy the gardens and grounds he meticulously cares for. But Morgan doesn't commute to New York by rail, even though he owns much of the industry. That would be far too ordinary. Instead, he commissions a 185-foot yacht and names it Corsair. The name is fitting. Corsair refers to a ship built for seizing control of others. And Morgan's yacht will soon serve as the stage for one of his most famous power plays. In 1885, Morgan invites the presidents of New York Central Railroad and the Pennsylvania Railroad. Aboard, the two companies are embroiled in a bitter feud, fighting over passengers, freight, fares, land, and rail lines.
Morgan was involved in New York Central. I think he had sold securities for Vanderbilt, who was the main owner of New York Central in the 1870s. And in the middle of the 1880s, these railroads, and this is an example of what Morgan would call excessive competition. In the New York Central faced competition from a new railroad called the West Shore Railroad, and it was going to build a railroad sort of paralleling the line of the New York Central, and the Pennsylvania Railroad supported this West Shore Railroad because it thought that the competition for its New York Central with New York Central would be in its interest. You know, if New York Central had a competitor, that was in the interest of the Pennsylvania Railroad. At the same time, some people were building a competitor to the Pennsylvania Railroad.
The rivalry between the two companies is destabilizing the entire industry, and investors are growing anxious. If the conflict continues, stock prices will plunge and millions will be lost.
And Morgan looked at this and he said, well, these two railroads, Pennsylvania and New York Central, don't really need this competition. And so he called the leaders of the two big railroads, New York Central and Pennsylvania, to have a meeting on his yacht, the Corsair.
Morgan promises the two men that the Corsair will take them to a remote location where they can negotiate a truce. As the ship leaves the dock, Morgan explains the stakes.
In 1885, the railroad industry took in twice the amount of revenue as the federal government. It was
Holy fuck.
Yeah,
Oh
yeah.
my God.
It was the nation's largest employer. The railroaders, which were the railroad entrepreneurs, that's why they were called railroaders, owned over 10% of the landmass in the United States.
This isn't just a business dispute. Their feud is threatening the entire US economy. British investors have poured $1.5 billion into America's booming industries, and their confidence is waning. And if the railroads don't resolve their differences, could be catastrophic. The railroad presidents sit stunned as Morgan's words sink in. But then comes the twist. Morgan reveals that he has lied. They aren't heading to a remote location. They will remain on the Corsair, and the ship won't dock until Morgan has a deal in hand. The two presidents groan and protest, but Morgan is immovable. It is a textbook strong-arm tactic, straight out of one of Napoleon's military handbooks. All day, the Corsair cruises up and down the Hudson River. The presidents argue, negotiate, and eventually give in. Exhausted and seasick, they finally agree to a truce. Only then does Morgan order the ship to dock.
So instead of having four railroads competing with each other, you ended up with the New York Central and the Pennsylvania being just two railroads, and there was less competition, and Morgan thought this was in the best interest of the investors of both the Pennsylvania and the New York Central, and he managed to persuade the leaders of those big existing railroads that his solution was better than the one they were working on.
The agreement becomes known, and it is a massive victory for Morgan. He not only stabilizes the industry, but also walks away with $1 million in profits and a $100,000 personal bonus.
So that was an example of the kind of power he had.
The deal cements Morgan's reputation as the ultimate fixer, the man who can solve any problem, no matter how large or complex. But as his reputation soars, Morgan receives tragic news from London. His father, Junius, has passed away, leaving him the majority of his family's $15 million fortune. For Morgan, the loss is bittersweet. For the first time in his life, he is truly free. With no strings holding him back, Morgan's ambition and his spending knows no limits. One of his first moves is to commission a new yacht, the Corsair II. It is nearly the largest yacht in the world, and Morgan spares no expense. He hands his shipbuilder a blank check and simply says, "Keep drawing checks until you are stopped." The Corsair II is a floating palace, real fireplaces with wood-burning grates, full-size bathtubs in the staterooms, central heating so the yacht can be used year-round. For the moment, life is good.
He would take 3 months off every year and get on his yacht and sail around the world. And he famously said, "I can do a year's work in 9 months, but I cannot do it in 12. So he had to take 3 months off.
When people ask how much his yacht costs, Morgan gives his now famous reply, "If you have to ask, you can't afford it." But the good times don't last. By 1893, the economy is in free fall. Entire industries are collapsing. In just 1 year, 192 railroad lines file for bankruptcy. The crisis hits Morgan's beloved railroads especially hard. But the damage doesn't stop there. The US government itself is on the brink of financial ruin. At the time, the American dollar is backed by gold, but the reserves are rapidly depleting. Foreign creditors are calling in debts, and the government is running out of gold to pay them. Without intervention, the US will default on its obligations in just 3 weeks. For Morgan, this isn't just a national crisis. It is a problem to solve. He drafts a plan to stop the gold drain and sends it directly to President Cleveland. Confident in his solution, Morgan sits in his library playing solitaire as he waits for the president's reply.
I think Pierpont Morgan certainly felt that he was the equal of the President of the United States.
The response comes quickly. Cleveland rejects the plan. Instead, the government intends to issue bonds to restore market confidence. Morgan is outraged. He can't understand why the government would choose delay over decisive action. Furious, he leaves his library and boards a train to Washington. demanding an audience with the president. At first, Cleveland refuses to see him, but Morgan isn't a man who accepts no for an answer.
I have come to see the president, and I'm going to stay here until I do.
Eventually, Cleveland accepts. Morgan lays out his plan again, explaining how the government can use a Civil War-era loophole to buy back gold and replenish its reserves. Cleveland is unmoved. Then fate intervenes. As the two men are talking, a messenger arrives with urgent news. The reserves have dipped to a dangerously low $9 million. Morgan seizes the moment.
I personally know a man who has a draft for $12 million in gold. If you like, I can call him, and he can wipe out the US government by 3 o'clock this afternoon.
Reluctantly, Cleveland agrees to Morgan's terms. The crisis is avoided, and the gold rush stops. It is Cleveland's name on the plan, but everyone knows who has saved the day.
At that moment, Morgan was clearly the most powerful man in America, and clearly at that moment, more powerful than the President of the United States.
JP Morgan has done what no one else could. He has made presidents open their doors, forced rivals to cooperate, and single-handedly saved the nation from collapse. But his actions raised troubling questions.
People began to decide that Pierpont had too much power to be able to save the government of the United States. It's an extraordinary thing. And therefore, the only way that he could have done it is by having some sort of evil capability.
It seems like Morgan is invincible and his power unlimited. But soon, Morgan is forced to fight the battle of his life. Every time you play Monopoly, you're playing a game modeled after JP Morgan himself. The top hat, the mustache, the endless control of properties. Morgan is the real-life Mr. Monopoly, and it's fitting. But at this point in his life, Morgan isn't just a regular powerful financier. He has the reputation of being a ruthless monopoly master, slowly posing a threat to everyday Americans.
A lot of people just thought he had too much power, and so he was potentially ruthless. But you could not really come up with a lot of examples of his being ruthless. I mean, he did merge companies together, and I think, Americans sort of don't like concentrated power. They don't like concentrated financial power, especially the whole history of the country. The early in the United States history, we had two central banks and they were considered to be too powerful, so we got rid of them. And I think Morgan had that same kind of power in his day, and so it was the American suspicion of concentrated financial power that made people think he was ruthless, but there aren't really a lot of examples of his being especially ruthless.
But that's not all.
He was also organizing giant industrial trusts, railroad monopolies. U.S. Steel controlled 66% of the U.S. steel industry. General Electric, monopolies and trusts were something that were of tremendous concern and a source of tremendous fear to Americans in the late 19th century, as it seemed that big business was just taking over the country and ruining the sort of democratic ideal that people had come to this country for.
And Morgan would soon prove that, in fact, big business is taking over the country.
I owe the public nothing.
Morgan is about to change America forever.
Morgan had formed another very large company called Federal Steel, and that was in response to what Morgan viewed as the excessive competition in the steel industry, which was undermining the profitability of these companies. So Morgan's basic idea was there was excessive competition, cutthroat competition, and that was endangering the earnings of the companies, which meant that it was endangering the value of the investments that Morgan had sold to his investors.
And nothing is more important to Morgan than to keep his investors happy, protecting his war chest of an empire. But there is one company in particular that stands in the way of Morgan's quest for total dominance. The nation's biggest steel company, Carnegie Steel, built by American steel magnate Andrew Carnegie. a man notorious for engaging in fierce price wars like no other, and a huge threat in Morgan's eyes.
Now, Carnegie was not a public company. Carnegie was a private company. It was basically owned by Andrew Carnegie, but it was a very large corporation. And so Andrew Carnegie didn't have to answer to public investors. And so he could engage in, price cutting, and this bothered Morgan because it meant that it was endangering the profits of the companies that Morgan had sold securities for.
Carnegie had no doubt that he could compete with Morgan's steel firms, and in fact that he could drive them out of business. And he had every reason to believe this. He knew that Morgan's firms couldn't match his costs. They were inefficient. They didn't have the kind of technology that Carnegie's plants had. They had a lot of stockholders to pay dividends to. They had a lot of borrowed money to pay interest on. They simply could not compete with Carnegie Steel.
Carnegie is confident that within 5 years, at most 10, he could eliminate Morgan and the world of steel would be his alone. On the other side, Morgan, not one to back down, prepares his company to go to war against Carnegie Steel. But he secretly knows that he only has two options: fight and be crushed, or buy Carnegie out and claim the steel throne. As he is pondering his ever-present plans of conquest, Morgan attends a New York dinner speech addressed to 80 financiers. He is hypnotized when Carnegie's right-hand man presents a vision for a steel super trust, a monopoly-like steel corporation that would make everything from raw steel to finished products. But at the top of this steel behemoth would sit none other than Carnegie Steel. Morgan has no time to waste anymore. He must buy Carnegie Steel before any steel super trust is formed. If he pulls this off, he will cement his status in history books for centuries to come, the biggest acquisition ever witnessed by humankind. However, convincing Carnegie of selling would be by no means an easy task. And unlike Morgan, Carnegie grew up poor and was never gifted a penny when building his empire. But Carnegie is already in his mid-60s, and although he is on the edge of total triumph, he has grown tired of the grueling and cutthroat business world. He wants to spend more time with his family and dedicate his wealth to philanthropy. And even better, by selling to JP Morgan, he could exit the steel business at its peak and finally claim the title of being the richest person on earth. Shortly after the New York dinner speech, Morgan invites a Carnegie Steel representative to his storied Black Library of his Madison Avenue home. The negotiation of the century is about to go down, at least he thinks. But against Morgan's expectation, it quickly becomes evident that Andrew Carnegie is actually very open to a sale of his empire. The only problem? It will require an amount of money that would make most men's hearts stop. The very next morning, Carnegie sends Morgan a note to Morgan's Wall Street office, his asking price written on it. Morgan opens it, glances at the number, and says $480 million. While the number is staggering, more money has never been paid in a merger up until that point. Morgan puts it into perspective.
Morgan said, "Congratulations, Mr. Carnegie, you are now the richest man in the world." And Carnegie said, "I wonder if I could have gotten $100 million more. I probably should have asked for that." And Morgan said, "If you had, you would have gotten it."
Why? Because this deal gives Morgan something no one else has: absolute dominance. With one stroke of the pen, Morgan controls about 2/3 of the country's steel and creates the world's first billion-dollar business, US Steel. Morgan is at the height of his powers. He owns 1/3 of America's railroads. He controls 20% of the companies on the US stock market. He has bailed out the federal government.
It's very hard to imagine anybody today having as much power as Morgan did, because not only was he acting like the Federal Reserve, in which case you would say the parallel was to Alan Greenspan and maybe Greenspan and Rubin together during the Clinton administration, but he was building industries. He was basically helping the railroads get funding to get started. He organized U.S. Steel. He backed Thomas Edison in the beginning and eventually organized General Electric. So he was doing so many different kinds of things. You can't imagine one person today having that much power. Certainly Gates is part of it, Greenspan is part of it. They're also government organizations.
If Morgan wants something done, it gets done. When Morgan wants art, he buys it. When he wants women, even famous actresses, they are his. When he wants the press to keep his extramarital affairs quiet, they comply. He finances the Panama Canal. He orchestrates elections, ensuring William McKinley's re-election in 1900. But Morgan doesn't always get his way. And when he doesn't shy away from violence.
He had a very powerful presence. Descriptions of him walking up and down Wall Street, pushing people out of the way. But the fact is, he didn't have to push people out of the way. They saw him coming and they leapt out of the way.
Photographers aren't allowed to take his picture without permission. Why? To cover up his deepest insecurity. Morgan suffers from the cauliflower nose disorder.
It had the terrible effect of inflating his nose, and it was really just an awful eyesore. And for that reason, all the pictures of Pierpont are actually retouched to reduce the size of his nose.
When someone dares to take an unapproved photo, Morgan reacts with fury. In one rare photograph, he's caught in the act, about to strike a photographer who disobeyed his rules, but he has far more serious problems to deal with. In 1901, McKinley, a pro-business president, is assassinated. His vice president, Theodore Roosevelt, takes office. And Roosevelt is no friend of J.P. Morgan. Roosevelt has heard of Morgan's influence, his control of industries, his nickname as the American Napoleon. Roosevelt is determined to bring him down.
The minute Roosevelt came in 1901, one of the first things he did was bring an antitrust suit against one of Morgan's big railroad combinations, which really shocked Morgan. He was used to cooperation from presidents, not opposition, and certainly not a federal lawsuit. That very much established Roosevelt's reputation as a trust buster.
One of Roosevelt's first acts is to dismantle Morgan's rail monopoly.
Roosevelt thought that there was too much financial power in this one corporation.
Using the Sherman Antitrust Act, Roosevelt targets Northern Securities, one of Morgan's most powerful companies. The monopoly is dismantled. Morgan is furious. Roosevelt has defied him in a way few dare. Their rivalry is no secret and reaches its peak in 1904.
Pierpont Morgan resented Theodore Roosevelt, finally. And once when he heard that Roosevelt was going off to Africa on a safari, Morgan said, "Good, I hope the first lion that meets him does his duty."
If eggs had existed back then, the feud would have gone viral. But grudges have to be set aside when crisis strikes in 1907. 5 major businesses collapse, triggering a chain reaction. Panic sweeps through the markets. People line up to withdraw their cash from banks.
The problem was there were runs on banks in New York City, which was the financial center of the United States then. Morgan wanted to stop those runs. Today a central bank would come and lend money to financial institutions to tide them over this run on the bank. But we didn't have a central bank.
If nothing is done, the entire economy could spiral into catastrophe. Despite his distaste for Morgan, Roosevelt knows there is no one better suited to handle the crisis. Against his own instincts, he calls Morgan to Washington. Morgan acts swiftly. He gathers the presidents of the country's largest banks and trusts, bringing them into a private library. Morgan dictates the terms for stopping the panic, closes the doors and locks them inside. The executives beg to be let out, but Morgan sits outside playing solitaire, unmoved, until 3 a.m. By morning, they have agreed to his terms.
And so Morgan basically investigated the firms and decided which ones needed to be saved. And he had the Secretary of the Treasury come to New York and deposit money in the banks. That helped. And he did a number of things. He prevented the New York Stock Exchange from shutting down when it was about to. He lent money to New York City because it had a interest payment due in Europe, but it didn't have the money to pay it. So Morgan basically lent the money to do that. And then he found out that a brokerage firm was about to fail, and so he organized a sale of the company that the brokerage firm had invested in to United States Steel. The company was called Tennessee Coal and Iron. Morgan and the brokerage firm was heavily involved in that, and it could not meet the payments. So Morgan bailed out the brokerage firm by engineering a merger of Tennessee Coal and Iron into United States Steel. Basically, what he was doing was acting as a lender of the last resort. He was doing the work of a central bank. That's where he got the reputation of being a one-man central bank.
The crisis is averted, the stock market is saved, and panic subsides. Morgan walks out of the ordeal a hero. Crowds cheer him on the streets, grateful for his role in saving the economy. It is a scene that sums up Morgan's entire larger-than-life status. He isn't just a banker or a businessman. He is the chairman of the board, no matter whose name is on the door. Presidents, CEOs, industry leaders, they all know who truly holds the power. He lives a life as grand as his appetite.
He consumed enormous quantities of port, sherry, and wine with dinner. He had breakfasts so large they could have killed a horse.
His New York mansion is the first home in the city to be fully powered by electricity. The Corsair 3, his final yacht, is so large the US government commandeers it for both world wars. When he demands ships, he doesn't just own them. He builds the largest ones ever, including the Titanic. It is only by sheer luck that Morgan misses the Titanic's fateful first voyage. When he dies in 1913, Wall Street flew its flags at half-mast. The New York Stock Exchange shuts down for half a day, an honor typically reserved for presidents, and even the Pope calls Morgan a good man. But unlike other tycoons of his day, Morgan's legacy was really never about money.
By the time Morgan died in 1913, his estate was worth about $80 million. That was a lot less than anybody imagined because he had so much power. 80 million then is, you have to multiply by 15 or 20 to think of what that would be worth in today's dollars. So, but John D. Rockefeller in 1913 was already worth $1,013,000. And supposedly when Morgan died, Rockefeller read about his net worth in the New York Times and shook his head and said, and to think he wasn't even a rich man.
But his death raises a question that still holds relevance today. Should one man ever have that much power?
Well, I think nobody had quite the financial power that Morgan did. I mean, he was. Some people call him a one-man central bank. You know, the United States did not have a central bank during Morgan's lifetime, but it had many financial problems that central banks can solve. And so Morgan was like a one-man central bank. There's nobody like that today. The United States, of course, is right after Morgan died, we created the Federal Reserve System to replace him.
The Federal Reserve is created and designed to prevent any one individual from ever holding such control again. And yet, more than a century later, Morgan's legacy still looms large. One thing is clear, there will never be another J.P. Morgan.
But I think the person who probably comes closest, interestingly enough, is the head of J.P. Morgan Chase, the financial institution, which is just about the largest bank in the world, I think. There are some differences between international and American accounting and the way that financial derivatives are treated. But I think if you made the international accounts uniform, J.P. Morgan Chase could well be the biggest bank in the world today. And its leader, a man named Jamie Dimon, obviously has a lot of clout as a leader of what may be the largest bank in the world. And so I think that he would probably come closest to being the J.P. Morgan type figure, and it's rather appropriate that he is the head of a bank called J.P. Morgan Chase.
J.P. Morgan's company eventually evolved into J.P. Morgan Chase. With assets surpassing trillions of dollars, it wields immense influence and is credited to have saved the American economy in the aftermath of the financial crisis in 2008. But its dominance and influence has also led to frequent scrutiny. Critics argue that it has grown too powerful, resembling a monopoly in American banking. Whether those criticisms are fair or not, one thing is certain: the man who built monopoly-like empires like no other would probably have been very proud. And today's leader of JP Morgan, Jamie Dimon, who we have made a documentary on too, is doing his best to keep pushing the boundaries of power.